Hello, everyone, and welcome to Heller Consulting's webinar. Our topic today is why executive sponsors are critical to technology transformation success. We've got Sarah Oates from the Canadian Cancer Society and Keith Heller and Smita from Heller Consulting. My name is Kathy Moore. I'm a senior strategist and a change management practitioner with Heller Consulting. I'll be your monitor for today. Before we get started, I'd like to cover some housekeeping items. All audio lines have been muted to ensure high quality audio. Today's webinar will run until 3. We'd like the webinar today to be highly interactive with a mix of information sharing, some polls, and interview style questions. We encourage you to ask your questions along the way. If you have a question during the presentation, you can post it in the question box located on the panel on the right-hand side of your screen in the GoToWebinar user interface panel. I'll be moderating today, and I'll present the questions to the presenters during the different segments. Also, the recording of this webinar will be emailed to all of you after the webinar. It will be available on our website as well. Finally, please don't forget to check out our website at teamheller.com for a number of free resources, including blogs, guides, and webinars. Now I'm going to hand it off to our presenters. Smita?
Thank you so much, Kathy. Before we introduce ourselves, I wanted to start with a story, a personal story, which was a turning point for me in understanding what sponsorship was and how it actually impacts a project. So several years ago, I was on a project where we were moving to a new fundraising system. It was a major transformation for the organization, and we had all the right ingredients in place. We had an excellent project team, great project managers, subject matter experts, we had great vendors, we had a healthy budget, we had enough time to do the project, and everyone was pretty bought in. They were excited about this change. And we had a sponsor who signed the check and also got board approval for this project. So all was on its way, seemed like everything would go well. So as we progressed through the project, getting close to launch, we noticed things weren't going that well. In particular, as you all might know, in any kind of major technology project, it takes a lot of work from those in the organization, apart from your day-to-day job. And what was happening was we were missing deadlines. People were not able to get the work done. And more importantly, people weren't being held accountable to doing that. So it was a problem on this project. So the project team assembled together and we talked about what was happening here. So why weren't people doing, missing deadlines, doing what they needed to do if they were excited about this change? And we understood it as they weren't being held accountable. Then we thought about who was not holding them accountable. And that led to the sponsor. And then we thought about why isn't the sponsor holding folks accountable? Why not? And someone on our project team had the insight, which was a little difficult to recognize, that maybe the sponsor wasn't in support of this project. That actually, if we think about it from the sponsor's perspective, this particular technology project was not in the personal interest of that sponsor. Actually, by moving to this new system, the sponsor would actually be demoted. And so, therefore, that might be the root cause. And when we realized that, it was, very difficult, but we had a really courageous and brave team member who said, you know what, they had a good relationship with the sponsor and confronted the sponsor about this and asked the question. And actually, the sponsor said, yes, that was the reason. And after acknowledging that, the sponsor stepped down, we got a new sponsor, the project got back on track. It was back on track, but there was some collateral damage. Timeline was impacted. We had to spend more money. But the lesson learned in that example was that myself and the project team members thought, all a sponsor needs to do is sign a check and show up once in a while. Honestly, as someone working on project teams, I thought, we are doing all the work, project team members. The sponsors just show up. They don't really have any impact. But this was a really eye-opening story in that I learned that actually, even though we didn't see it, the sponsor had major impact by not doing what they needed to do, by holding people accountable. So after that point, we learned that sponsorship is actually really critical. And that's what we want to do in today's webinar, is really share some of those lessons learned and best practices, hear from two sponsors, Sarah and Keith. So I'm excited to do this today. So I'm Smita Vadakekalam. I'm a COO and Senior Strategist at Heller Consulting. I've been doing CRM implementations and change management for 14 years. I'm really excited to introduce our two guests here. We have Sarah Oates. She's Executive Vice President of Finance and Operations with the Canadian Cancer Society. She has been an executive sponsor and is an executive sponsor on many major projects. So she's here today to share perspective. So Sarah, could you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work of CCS?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. As you've already mentioned, I'm responsible for finance and operations with the Canadian Cancer Society. The Society is the largest health charity in Canada, and it's also the largest non-governmental funder of cancer research in Canada, as well as providing services across the spectrum of the cancer care journey. At the minute, we are knee-deep in the midst of a Salesforce implementation, partnering with the Heller team. It's an enormous project for us. It'll replace 14 CRM systems with a nationwide system, which will support our people from across the country. So the topic of executive sponsorship is very near and dear to our hearts at the minute.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And we also have Keith Heller. He is the founder and chief strategist of Heller Consulting. And Keith has been the coach for many executive sponsors at major nonprofit organizations over the 20 years. And so he's going to share with us his perspective on being a coach and being a sponsor himself. Keith, do you mind sharing a little bit about your background and Heller Consulting?
Sure. Thanks, Smita. Yeah, and thank you, Sarah, for being on this webinar with us today. I got started in nonprofits in '93 and started Heller Consulting in '96, and so my whole career has been around nonprofits and technology and trying to make cool things happen. And you know, to make that happen, you have to work with the executives. For us, for me in my role at our client site, and so I've just seen a lot of different scenarios over the years, and what works really well and what doesn't, and I'm just happy to share some of my experience today.
Great, thanks so much. So as you can see here, we're going to have an opportunity to hear from Sarah and Keith throughout this webinar. We'll be asking them some questions that we've collected from the nonprofit community and burning questions about sponsorship. And along with the interview, I'll share some key information and research and best practices about sponsorship. And we'll talk about what is executive sponsorship, share some examples of executive sponsorship gone wrong, talk about good, effective executive sponsorship, and also how do you support executive sponsorship. So we'll tackle all of those topics. And so as Kathy said at the beginning of this webinar, this is an interactive webinar, so please post your questions throughout the webinar. We will be asking those questions throughout. So we are going to start with a poll. So I'd love to just get a sense from those of you in the audience, what is your executive sponsor effective on your project? And remember, this is anonymous, no worries. And so, yes, very much so, somewhat, not at all, or we don't have a sponsor. So I'll just give you a few seconds to answer. And Kathy, when we're ready, if you don't mind sharing the results.
Give people another 10 seconds. It is looking like 50% have answered somewhat. 17% have answered yes, very much. And 33% have indicated that they don't have an executive sponsor.
Ooh.
Third, very interesting.
Yes. Well, that 17, if I heard that correctly, 17% who said yes, very much so. Share your insights and best practices throughout the chat. And those who said somewhat, hopefully the stuff we covered today will be helpful in either if you're a sponsor yourself or supporting your sponsor. And those who said 33%, which who don't have a sponsor, I guess my first tip to you is get one. So get a sponsor, and hopefully by the end of this webinar, you'll have some good tips and strategies on how to pick the right sponsor. Thanks so much. So one interesting statistic that I learned several years ago, and this is still current today, is something that came from ProSci, which is a major research and training organization for change management. They conducted research over the past 15 years and gathered data on the key factor for a project success. They do their studies globally and across industries. And one interesting thing they found was that effective executive sponsorship comes up as number 1 or 2 as a key factor for a project, successful project over the past 10 years. So this was really compelling, especially to all of us, in that this really matters. So we really need to pay attention to this. And executive sponsorship is much more than just that person who's signing the check. Before we ask some questions to Sarah and Keith, I just wanted to share some of these myths about or misconceptions about sponsorship. And these are misconceptions I had previously about sponsorship. So one of them is that sponsors have a ton of time dedicated to this project. That's important to just acknowledge, and I have to admit that that is a perspective that I may have had, and it's definitely a myth. Another myth is one that the right sponsor is the one signing the check. And as you saw from that story that I shared at the beginning of the webinar, that's not always the case. You have someone signing the check, they may or may not be the right sponsor for your particular project. Another myth that actually took me a while to actually realize was that a sponsor, whoever's in the position of sponsor, already knows what to do, already knows how to be a sponsor. If they're in a position of leadership, they should just automatically know what to do. That has been the most interesting myth to unravel. And so in the webinar today, I think we'll, in our discussion with Sarah and Keith, just learn a little bit about what that means and how to support sponsors. So I'm going to pivot over to Sarah and Scott and ask some questions. So Sarah, let's just start with the question about what does sponsorship look like for you at your organization? How do people perceive sponsorship?
Well, I mean, as you've already referenced, Smita, there's definitely multiple functions for a sponsor, and that's definitely the situation in our case. I think that one of my key roles is really to keep the project aligned with the society's values and strategic direction, especially because we've been going through an enormous transformation in the last couple of years, and therefore our direction continues to evolve, and it's really important to have that high-level involvement in the project to make sure that as it progresses, it continues to be aligned with the high-level goals of the organization. You've already mentioned the question of accountability, and that works both ways. I mean, certainly as a point person, I'm ultimately the one who's accountable for both, hopefully the success, but potentially the failure of the organization. So it's on me to make sure that it gets pushed forward. But it's also a question of one of the other roles that I play is really to hold the team accountable, to make sure that we keep an eye on the key milestones and keep pushing people and keep asking the hard questions. I'm also the point person with various stakeholder groups, including the board of directors and other senior management levels, and the communication part of the executive sponsor role is a really important one. And I think that lastly, for a project like this, it's really important, it's especially important to have executive sponsorship because it is a project that cuts across multiple different functions. And therefore, it is important to have high-level buy-in, to have a high-level involvement to ensure engagement across all of those functions, especially when for some of those departments it's hard for them to see how they're going to benefit ultimately from the project, but it's still important that they're engaged in the project throughout. And then the last thing I would say is, because these projects generally take quite a while to implement, it's important to have somebody who's senior who can be really a chief cheerleader to keep the enthusiasm alive and to keep the project and the progress really as visible as possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. With that detail, that's really helpful. Keith, can I ask you, from your experience working with and coaching sponsors at major nonprofit organizations, what's something surprising you've learned about sponsorship that maybe the rest of us wouldn't be aware of?
Well, that's a great question. And you know, when I started to play this role in projects, I had no idea what I was doing. I had the title of founder of Heller Consulting, but that came with no experience in how to do this. So I really appreciated your comment earlier. This is something that, as an executive, we have to learn. And one of the things that surprised me, I'll say two things. One is that one of the key responsibilities of the executive sponsor is deceptively simple, and that is around messaging. So, you know, we talk a lot with our clients around developing a message that the executive sponsor can carry forth with everyone else. But the message itself is usually pretty straightforward. This project is important to the organization. I personally believe in this project. This project is going to help us as an organization achieve three things. And quite often those three things are something like, we're going to be more efficient, we're going to raise more money, we're going to deliver more of our services to more people. And then they end by saying, this project is really important to the organization, this project is really important to me. And we develop this message, and then the amazing thing is, like, a big job of the executive sponsor is to say that over and over and over again in every situation. And I think I learned, from you, Smita, that people, myself included, we don't learn something until we've heard it 7 times. It doesn't really sink in. And so that repetition is beneficial. We don't have to come up as an executive sponsor. We don't have to come up like, gosh, it's a new month, it's a new quarter, I need a new message. Nope, same message over and over. The other thing that was surprising to me was that another, I think, primary role for the executive sponsor is on the other hand, very complex and nuanced, which is when you say that message to people, they have feelings. They have feelings about that message, and they have feelings about the project. And as an executive sponsor, I think one of the responsibilities is to hold those feelings. And I'm not going to say manage, because you're not trying to manage, but you're trying to navigate with that person and for that person how they're feeling about it. And individuals and groups, and sometimes those feelings are, oh my gosh, this is amazing, I can't wait. Can we do this tomorrow? And sometimes it's, I don't really know about this. I'm not sure if I believe in this project, or I don't like this project at all. And I'm either going to tell you or I'm not going to tell you. And sometimes that's present in the same people or person at the same time. So while the messaging is simple, working with people's reactions is much more subtle and complex and really important.
Thank you, Keith. Sarah, I would like to ask you a question about, who are the different stakeholders you are constantly balancing that maybe the rest of us may not be aware of? Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of voices to be heard in a project like this, and certainly it's really important to have a full understanding of who's going to be responsible for communicating with all of those different stakeholders. But for my role in particular, the key communications that I'm responsible for are firstly with other members of the senior management team to make sure that they stay informed and enthused so that they can also be cheerleaders within their own particular areas. Certainly with the project leads, then that's a really key part of the communication. And also, quite frankly, with the organisation as a whole, because it is important that the whole organisation sees that there's that top level engagement and enthusiasm and real drive behind the implementation of the project. The other two key stakeholders. One, of course, is the implementation partner. Our team at Hella is a key part of that communication, and it's really important that I stay in contact with the implementation team on a regular basis to make sure that we can deal with any issues as they arise. And then lastly, I would say that the other key group, which maybe the staff don't see as much, but which is really an important part of my work, is the communication with the board of directors and the committees of the board, like our finance committee. The board and the committee are really invested in the project. I mean, it was a big part of what I did was to get them enthusiastic about the project, to get them on the bus for this journey with us. And now that they're on the bus on the journey, then they're really invested, and they have, from their own experiences, they often have some very strong opinions about what we should and shouldn't be doing. Those kind of insights can be really useful. But it's definitely an element of input that needs to be balanced within the project, and that is a very key part of the role that I play with this.
Thank you for that, Sarah. That is something I know I sometimes forget about the board, that key role, because they're handling it behind the scenes. So thank you for that. I'm going to take a moment now to Kathy to see if we have any questions from the audience.
We do. I'm a beginning or new executive sponsor, and I'm wondering if you have any specific suggestions on things I can do to reinforce positive behavior or hold people accountable. Sarah mentioned asking tough questions as well as being the chief cheerleader. Do you have any specific examples of ways that you would do those or specific questions?
Well, I think that it is, when it comes to being the chief cheerleader, it's not just for the project, but it's also for the team. And a key part of that is really ensuring that recognition is an important part of the way forward. I mean, these are complex and long projects, and it can be tiring. I'll be truthful, even with awesome implementation partners like Hella, it's still a long project. So it's really important that you take time on a regular basis to recognize where things are going well and to keep people's spirits up and to really make that part of the communication. It's not just something that you do on an ad hoc basis, but to make it part of, on a regular basis, recognizing where things are going well and recognizing the things that are being achieved along the way. And that's also part of, I think, as we move into the implementation phase where we move into launch and then seeing adoption, I think that's something that we're certainly envisaging being part of our ways of driving engagement, of really recognizing people who are early adopters, who are strong adopters, and real positive reinforcement. The other side of that, from an accountability side, is really to be clear about what the measures are and to have strong ways of communication so that you're identifying where there's issues on a timely basis and can communicate those as well. Obviously not necessarily calling them out. We're not talking about having a wall of shame or anything like that where things aren't getting done, but certainly having a way of identifying and being able to reach out to people where things aren't being done on a timely basis. And as we move forward to the launch, then that's also part of the work that we're planning to do. We're envisaging bringing in performance measures so that from the CEO to the regional executive directors down, everybody will have performance measures that they will be accountable for in terms of the adoption and use of our system. And that'll be a really important part of us being able to recognize the people who are part of the success of the organization, of this transformation, and really drive the change within the organization.
Thank you. Kathy, I'm going to ask you to hold on to some additional questions. We'll have another opportunity to do more questions. Thank you, Sarah. I love the very specifics about accountability that you have in place. We're going to move on to an interesting topic. Oops, I'm sorry about that. We're going to talk about bad sponsorship. And we're going to take a moment, just do this and do another poll, because I'd love to see what bad sponsorship looks like from your experience, audience. We're going to have Kathy administer that poll. Does it look like micromanagement, absent sponsor, actively sabotaging a project, or D, all of the above? So this is more, what have you experienced when it comes to bad sponsorship? And Kathy, just let us know when you're ready with results.
I have to say that all of the above does not sound good. I was trying to think of how that would work, that you could do all of them at once, even like an absent sponsor who swoops in occasionally to micromanage the sabotaging of the project. Like, oh, that's
A third said all of the above.
Oh
no.
44% absent sponsor, unengaged sponsor, and then 22% answered other. So if you chose other, please do tell us in the question box what you've experienced, because we'd love to keep track of that.
Yes. Thank you, Kathy. So the reason, even though we're talking about the negative here, bad sponsorship, I think it is important to I know we've all kind of been in that position, probably have had elements of bad sponsorship. So these are nice red flags to be aware of. So if you're a sponsor, or if you're supporting a sponsor, to just take note of that, what's going on, and seeing what you can do to sort of change things. I just wanted to share some research, again, from ProSci, who has done studies globally across industry on research on bad sponsorship and what that looks like. And that tends to look like sponsors failing to remain visible and engaged, failure to demonstrate support the project in words and actions, failure to effectively communicate message about why the change or the need for change, which is a common theme we've heard throughout, ignoring the people side of change, and delegating or abdicating sponsorship roles and responsibility, which is what we also saw in the 44% poll results of lack of sponsorship or absent sponsors. I also asked around, before I pivot to Sarah and Keith, my friends in the nonprofit community about their examples of bad or good sponsorship. And I had a friend at a nonprofit give me an example of a sponsor who got into the technical design of the project and didn't really have the right skill set when doing so. So the sponsor would disagree with the technical team, and this really caused a lot of disruption and delays. And then a double whammy was that this sponsor left the organization, and then they never replaced the sponsor. So that was almost like several, things going on there. And unfortunately, I do know the end of that story. That organization did end up paying quite a bit of money because just for this project, because it took them longer, because of all that disruption. So I want to pivot and ask Sarah and Keith, about maybe, Sarah, can we start with you? If you could share a story or an example of bad sponsorship. It doesn't need to be you. I'm sure it's not you. Or maybe just share with us.
Sure. I mean, I've certainly been lucky enough to be involved in situations where there was very successful executive sponsorship, but I've certainly seen the situation where an executive sponsor has not been visible enough. Even in that situation, they were involved in the background and in getting involved in some of the key discussions, but from an external stakeholders point of view, then they just weren't visible. So for the broader user community, there wasn't really a point person who was talking to them on a regular basis. You know, to Keith's point, this is something that you need to talk about every single time, so that it just becomes an embedded part of the organization, where there's just acceptance of, yes, there's going to be a big change, and yes, we're going to transform, and there's going to be benefits. And you really do have to keep saying the same thing over and over again. And in this situation, the sponsor was not doing that, and was not talking to people, and was just not part of that repetitive communication, that cheerleading communication that really needed to happen. The other thing that was happening in that situation is there was also not clarity. There was also not real buy-in from that person. So often when they were talking to stakeholder groups, and they'd be positive and yes, this is a great thing, but then when that person was talking to some of the senior management team, then he would express doubts, and I'm not sure this is what we should be doing, and that seeped throughout the organization. You know, when it becomes known that the executive sponsor is not fully on side and is not fully convinced about the benefits of this, then when you're going through such a transformational project, it's impossible to get other people to, you know, make their lives initially more difficult by embracing change and doing something differently and taking on a new technology and being accountable in different ways. Then if that's not being led from the top with a really tangible enthusiasm and a really tangible confidence that this is a good thing for the organization, then it's almost impossible for a project to be successful.
Thanks for that. It seems like almost in those examples of bad sponsorship also allow you to understand what it means to have good sponsorship, but just the opposite of that. Yeah.
It was a very good lesson for me.
Keith, can you share from your experience of some bad sponsorship examples, or how that impacted a project success?
Yeah, and I think I'll share two examples. And the first one we saw come up in that poll, which the most prevalent thing that I see is the absence of any sponsorship. So a project kind of gets moved along usually by people, the project team members, and then someone higher up signs off on the contract, but the project team is left without a sponsor. And then we have these issues come into play that we've just been talking about. The other people in the organization don't understand that. What is this project? Oh, there is a project? What project? Like, why are we doing this project? Why are you asking me questions? Why should I participate? And so there's not sort of that leadership to really provide the vision and the support to the project team. And we see from the poll, a third of the people here may be experiencing something like that. The other side, and I see this much less often, but it just occurred to me around this question, is there is a sponsor, and the sponsor does understand that their role is to talk about the vision and encourage people, but their idea of encouragement is everybody has to be positive all the time, and sort of almost like bludgeoning people across the finish line, like, we're going to do this, and when people express, their concerns or their fears, those things get muffled or shunted aside. And positivity is good. Eye on the prize, moving everybody forward, that's all positive, but part of the role of the executive sponsor, or what's effective, in good sponsorship is also attention to difficult feelings that people have, the worries and the concerns. And that doesn't mean, we stop the whole train and that, we stop the project or we divert the project, but that we attend to these things. We attend to people's concerns. We do it clearly, and then we move on. But just sort of railroading things through, that ends up having repercussions later because people don't feel like this was my system, this is my solution, this is my technology. I feel like I was heard. I feel like I was part of the process. I feel like this is mine to use. And ultimately, those are, you want people feeling that way.
Thanks, Keith. There is something about, I like how you mentioned the being overly positive. We talk about how important that is, but then it becomes not genuine if you're not paying attention to the real stuff that's happening and concerns. Thanks.
Yeah. When I am in a role to kick off projects, one of the first things I say, and I encourage executive sponsors to say some version of this is going to be really hard. Because it is, it's a fact. But when you call out what people are afraid of, then you can do something with it. But if everybody, if an executive sponsor in their positivity dances around the fact that, not everything's going to be easy here, we're not going to hit every deadline the way we'd like, some things are going to go sideways. When you admit it, then you can deal with it. And when it happens, it's not a surprise. So, go ahead.
Thank you. Oh, no, I'm just going to pivot to Kathy to see if there's any questions from the audience.
Yeah, we've got a couple. We have a sponsor who's in the weeds too much, and I'm wondering if you have any recommendations on how we could approach that sponsor to help them understand the impact they're having by micromanaging.
Either of you want to take a stab?
Well, I think that in a situation like that, it certainly is dependent upon the kind of relationship that you have with the executive sponsor and the personality of the sponsor. But I think that one thing that can help, and one thing that I find useful of getting feedback from my team, is to have a standing item, to the extent that you have regular updates, which hopefully all executive sponsors have regular updates with their team, but to have a standing item on the agenda, which is something like, what is needed this week from the executive sponsor to move things forward, or what do each of us need to do differently this next week? And if you've got the right kind of environment where you can talk about those things, then that might be one where, if that, though, I find is often helpful when you need somebody to do something that they're not doing, and it's maybe a little bit harder when you want them to stop doing something. And then I think that it's finding the right person in the team, maybe the project lead, who can have a conversation about how do we do things differently, what challenges are we having with the team, and what do all of us need to be doing differently. But it's never an easy conversation, I don't think, but it's so dependent upon having the right kind of engagement with the executive sponsor and being able to talk about all kinds of issues as they arise.
Great. As you were talking, Sarah, I think you're right about context and having that standing meeting. I was thinking about, okay, so what if I was that sponsor and being micromanaged? How would I want to be approached without taking it personally and supporting the project versus getting defensive? And I think just thinking about maybe a tip or strategy for having that conversation would be to start by thinking that project team member coming to that sponsor and saying, listen, I just want to share with you how your role can be really impactful and important to this project in the following ways. And I see that maybe you're spending a lot of time and energy here, which doesn't allow you to be able to doing, the following, which is really going to, we need that. It's really important. And you specifically have the influence, power, talent to do that, drive that. And by the way, I feel really good and confident that we have X, Y, or Z member who's able to tackle the whatever detail thing that they're doing. So I think that by you doing X and, team member doing this detail work, it's going to make a real impact. Now, I'm responding from, it's a personality thing. That's how I would like to be approached if I was the one micromanaging. And I realized, like Sarah, you said it's all due to personality, context, and all of that, but that's one idea. Anything, Keith, from any suggestions?
I was going to line up with, I was thinking along the same lines as you, Smita. I guess what I would say is that at the very beginning of a project, there's something we like to do called, establishing project governance. Now that sounds, like a wonky project management term, because it is, but what it means is, you list what are the roles for the project and what does that role do, so that you can say, this is what we need the executive sponsor to do, and this is what we need the project lead to do and the project manager, so that you can refer back to that later. And I think, I really liked what you said, Smita, about go and have a positively framed conversation. Really appreciate your, energy for this project. So important. This is where we really need your help. You're uniquely positioned to do this for us. And let us take these other things off your plate so that you can be focused on that, because that's where we really need you. And then you kind of minimize the whole, and you're driving us absolutely nuts. We're going to go, everybody's going to leave this project.
Well,
and by the way, I know this not because of my own sponsorship of projects with clients, but because I feel like, and Smita, you've been with us for many years, I have been managed in this way before. And I thought that was really smart. I feel good about myself.
I was just thinking the same thing. I seem to recognize some of that terminology myself.
Yeah.
Work then, right? No.
I thought I was being praised, but actually I was kind of being shown the door a little bit.
Great. Kathy, are there any additional questions?
I've got one more. Our sponsor has a singular focus and can't seem to recognize the bigger picture. Do you have any suggestions?
New sponsor.
That's one approach.
I'll jump in and just say for a sec, sort of like the last example, sometimes somebody needs help seeing the bigger picture. So if you, as a project team, can articulate that bigger picture, then you can go to the executive sponsor and say, again, we really appreciate you working on our behalf. We've come to feel that if you could help us deliver this message, this would really benefit the project, and try to take their message from this to this. But if they don't seem to have the capacity themselves to do a broader vision, bring the vision to them so that they can then take it and deliver it.
Yeah, it's interesting what you mentioned, Keith. It's like, even though we are saying or setting that expectation that that's what the sponsor is supposed to do, have that bigger vision in an ideal scenario, right? Roles and responsibilities, and everybody else worries maybe about their area. But sometimes you need to, what I hear in that, and that's helpful, kind of flex out. Like if your sponsor doesn't see the bigger vision and you do, then it's your job to help them, to support them in seeing that, and repetition. I wonder also I like that suggestion that in addition, if there's another leadership person at the organization who, if you've identified who can see the bigger vision, to have them somehow have a conversation in a very, just talking about the project, and maybe they can also be used to help as colleagues maybe see that bigger vision or help that. So from another angle is another thought I have.
And I think also that if the governance structure is working correctly in terms of providing regular updates to other senior management members, to finance, or to the board, then I think that those conversations tend to drive focus on the bigger picture, even if an individual is going down a particular rabbit hole. Because certainly I find that those groups are very much focused on the high level questions. And one of the things that I talk to my team about is, as people do get very tied up in the detail of the minutiae of all of the various decisions, and I keep taking them back to, okay, but what are the board going to ask us about, and what are the finance committee, and what are senior management, because they are thinking about high level and how does this fit with the long-term future of the organization.
That's a really good. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So having that governance structure in place seems to be like a repeated theme that you can always go to, that having that really allows for that.
We also have a suggestion from the audience that ties in with that governance around agile methodology and the importance of building in the ability for team members to call a timeout and just openly talk about for 3 to 5 minutes about what's working, what's not working, and how the team can improve, and building that into every iteration in an agile project.
I like that. That's a great suggestion. Gonna keep that one. Well, I am going to, we actually covered some of this. We wanted to share, what to do if you don't have the right sponsor, if your sponsor is absent or doesn't know how to be a sponsor. And we talked a bit about that. I heard that Sarah and Keith come up with some of those suggestions. One thing I will mention, along with, I think what was mentioned was having that good, that structure in place with those regular check-ins, that structure in place where, if a sponsor doesn't know how to be a sponsor, you've already established that as part of the project, that as a project team member, you're going to be checking in, you're going to be helping with messaging, talking points, supporting that sponsor. Also, another thing, a strategy, if you don't have the right sponsor that we've seen work really well, is get a co-sponsor or an additional sponsor. In some projects, that's already having a sponsor coalition or 2 or 3 sponsors is just from the get-go a strategy, which is great. But it can also be a strategy when you have one that's not effective, but still needs to be there maybe politically, adding in the, maybe more sponsor who might be better suited as the co-sponsor can really, it's a nice way to kind of work around that. And we've seen some organizations do that and it'd be really successful. And then basically you're kind of having that other sponsor that you selected to be really doing 90% of sponsorship work. So also wanted to move on to the topic of effective sponsorship. And we've kind of talked a lot about this actually in our discussion about how good sponsorship basically shows up, and that is effective communication. It's like what we've heard from Sarah and Keith of repeating the message, the why, the need for the change over and over again. Credibility, which is, making sure that sponsor has trust within the organization. That's how they have incredible influence. I heard that from this conversation. Accountability, we heard that quite often actually so far in this conversation, how important it is for a sponsor to not only be accountable to the project for themselves, but keeping others accountable and rewarding positive behaviors and keeping accountable, recognizing the behaviors that don't benefit the project. Risk management is something we did touch around a little bit, but that is a very important part of a project, and just recognizing there are risks, for a sponsor to recognize there are risks and not be afraid to talk about it, kind of alluding to something Keith talked about earlier, and having the comfort level to have your project team engage in a very productive conversation that's about forward planning, about what we will do in in a situation of risk. And we say that because we've been in projects where the sponsor refuses to talk about any risk, and that creates a very bad situation. Positive leadership is really important, and that is that being able to influence, lead by example, and get people on board. And active listening is also very important, we found, and that goes into, I think it's a nice balance to positive leadership, that encouragement, that support. But active listening is something that Keith referred to, is about really making sure you are listening to your team members and really hearing the risks or concerns and navigating that. So those are some things we found that are really important for effective sponsorship. I also wanted to share a few just on screen here. These are other, we asked around other folks, sponsors in the nonprofit community, about their experiences as being effective sponsor. And I just want to call out one thing that's noted here that I thought was really helpful. This sponsor said that, you know, in their experience, they developed a little community of other orgs together who are also going through implementations. And after talking to that sponsor, they said that was really important because sometimes it can be lonely at the top and wanted an outside perspective. And that was really helpful to have that community of other peers so they can, you know, check against things, help her sort through challenges. So that was a nice little tip that was shared from that sponsor. Now I want to make sure we spend some time talking to Sarah and Keith. And this is where we can talk about, you know, positive examples of sponsorship, since we covered the bad examples. But Sarah, could you maybe share us a story with us of an impactful moment when you saw how the role of sponsor can make a difference on a project?
Yes, definitely on a previous project where I wasn't a sponsor, then I certainly saw how a strong executive sponsor can really drive adoption across the organization. And as we said before, it's really by making it part of the ongoing part of the conversation. You know, making sure that it's part of every single staff update, that it's talked about in staff meetings. It's just a given that everybody knows, oh yeah, this implementation is one of the key things that the organization is doing, so that everybody from coast to coast was aware of it. In that situation, it also became part of staff objectives even from before it was launched. So people were encouraged to learn more about it, attend training and information sessions, and there were set goals around that as well, so that it was really clear what was expected from everybody, and therefore it just became an integral part of the organizational priorities, rather than, you know, just something that was happening in the background and something that which one day would just magically appear. It really drove the project from being a technology implementation to being generally accepted as part of a wider organizational transformation. And that was really the key lesson learned in that one. The focus really wasn't just on the technology and the benefits that you could specifically get from the technology. It was around a broader change in how, as an organization, we were going to work and what that was going to mean to our donors, to our constituents, and ultimately to our mission. So it was really broadening the picture and understanding how that technology fit into where we wanted the organization to go, not just to flick a switch and to have a new kind of technology. So it was a very, it was really driven in very large part by how the executive sponsor treated it and as a key priority. And it was just given in their mind, it was a key priority, and it was just part of the lexicon of the organization.
Thank you for that, Sarah. Keith, could you share a story of an impactful moment from your perspective?
Yeah, so I'm remembering being in a meeting with the executive sponsor of for a client's project and the project team, and them getting the news that there was something in the project that was going to affect the timeline, and they had to make decisions around adjusting the timeline, and this was causing some distress among members of the project team. And what I really appreciated was the executive sponsor, first thing they did was nothing. They just stayed calm. And I'm reminded of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Don't Panic, little button. Like that was, I feel like we should give that out to all executive sponsors. What am I supposed to do? Oh yeah, don't panic. And so when, as others were feeling very distressed and they weren't, that immediately had a calming effect. And then, this person did a great job of asking questions, asking for people to voice their concerns. They practiced reflective listening. They said back, I hear you saying, and the person could feel like, oh yeah, they get it. Okay, that my concern has been registered. And then, they took a little bit of time themselves and weighed, seemed to be weighing what to do. And then they made a decision. They said, okay, the new, based on everything I've heard, the new deadline for X is going to be this date instead. And here's why. So they made their rationale clear, but they made that decision, and then they moved forward. So the whole process took into account, people's varying states of mind around all of it, but they were very even-keeled and clear and listened and made a decision, and then the project could keep going.
Thank you. Let's see. I want to make sure we have time for. I do want to ask Sarah actually a question, if you don't mind. What do you need, from others, your project team, in order to be an effective sponsor?
Well, I think that you've already touched on some of the things that have to be in place to be effective, and certainly one of those is having agreement with the team as to what the role of the executive sponsor is, like, what needs to be escalated. But I think that for me, what's supporting me in my current role as an executive sponsor, certainly those regular updates with the team members are critical. And having a forum where people can escalate things on a timely basis, but also, just if they've got concerns, bring those in an environment where they feel comfortable is key. I think also having a key focus on the various layers of communication. So especially from what is needed from me, being very clear about my responsibilities, around the board, around senior management, but also where I'm needed to be inserted if there's other communications that need to happen for groups that we may not, might be experiencing particular pain, for example, and is it useful for me to get involved in anywhere. But I would say that the other thing, and one of the things that because of the amount of detail in the project, the other key thing is really to focus on high-level summaries. It is really easy to get bogged down in the details. There is so much detail, and our team is very good at summarizing the key points and bringing the significant issues and having the detail to back them up to where I ask questions, but really being able to summarize those. And I think that that's a really key skill for a team to have, and it certainly helps me in my role to focus on the key things where they need my input.
Thank you for that, Sarah. Keith, I want to ask you kind of the opposite question of what do you find people often provide you as a sponsor that you actually don't need? This is your chance to tell us.
Facts and details. I don't need any of those. No. But the second one is where it's a little tricky. There is, and this is where, this executive sponsor gets to hold the big picture, and the project team is holding the details. And you want a division between those. And it can be hard for the project team not to bring details to the executive sponsor because that's what they're living in every day, and that is their area of responsibility. But I think to echo what you said, Sarah, what's most helpful to me are two things. One is, high-level summaries. What are the key things I need to understand about the large set of details? And the second is, what do you need from me? Either, what problem are you facing? And ideally, what I can do to help, or at least if you can articulate the problem, together we can figure out how I can play a role in facilitating a solution.
Thank you.
Oh, and I want to know stuff in a timely fashion. I would much rather hear about 5 potential problems that are never actually going to become real problems than one really huge problem that is already all over the place. So heads up, I need warning.
Okay, good to know. Noted. Duly noted. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe just one question, if that, actually. Go ahead, Kathy.
Go ahead. Earlier you mentioned that the 33% who don't have a sponsor should get one. Any advice on how to recruit that? Recruit a sponsor.
I have a thought. First is to outline what you need of the sponsor. What is that sponsor role going to look like? And then you can either identify in your organization someone who you think might be capable of that role and amenable to taking it on. So that would be great, and you can ask them. If that's not immediately apparent, who or the willingness of the right person, I would take that job description to the person writing the checks and say, this project is going to be more effective and more efficient and more likely to be on time and on budget if we had a sponsor who would do this. We know you're very busy, and we're not asking you, unless you are asking them, but here's what we need someone to do. Can you help us figure out who that person would be and recruit them?
That's a great suggestion. Go ahead, Sarah.
The other part is to understand which high-level leader in the organization would be most likely to benefit from the project. Who has the vested interest in making this a success? And they're going to be the best cheerleader.
That's great advice. Thank you. And then a little tactical add to that is, if you need to come up with that job description of what you need in a sponsor, we have written a guide on sponsorship that you can pull from that to get your job description. Just borrow, and it's free. It's on our website, which I realize time-wise we've got to end. Thank you so much, Keith and Sarah, for your time. This was incredibly helpful to me, and I'm sure the larger community. I do want to just end with that we have a ton of free resources on our website on sponsorship and a lot of different things. Visit the website, but also we're doing this change management survey, and we'd love folks to take it. It literally takes a minute, but we're going to use that data to see where nonprofits are with change and be able to write about this and benefit the larger community. And when you do take the survey, you'll be eligible for free 1-hour consultation. So please do that. The follow-up email that you'll receive will have the recording. We'll also have a link to that survey. And as always, you can feel free with any questions. If there were some burning questions you didn't get answered, email me and I'll get them answered by our experts here today. But thank you so much, everyone, for your time. And thank you so much, Keith and Sarah. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thank you, Smita. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.